Delamination is an adhesion problem, meaning somewhere along the line, something has occurred that has affected how the paint is adhering to the surface that you are painting in a negative way. Usually we find this out when we are using masking techniques, because when you go to remove the mask, the paint peels up with your mask. That's delamination. For those of you that follow the channel, you're probably aware that I use Createx paint pretty much exclusively. And in the 15 years or so that I've been using their paint system, I've had very few issues. I'm not saying it cannot fail, because it absolutely can. And in fact, I'm going to share one of my own failures with you in this video. But it's a very resilient paint system based on my own experience. I normally prefer to use these Artist Gesso panels when I'm creating videos for the channel. I like these because they have a very smooth gessoed surface on one side. They're relatively inexpensive. They don't soak up paint and warp, and you can paint over them numerous times. Most of the time when we experience a failure, it's a direct result of something that we as the artist either did or something we neglected to do. As I mentioned, I really like these panels. It has a super smooth gessoed surface on it, but it's still a very good idea to make sure this surface is very clean and to prep the surface before you begin painting on it, especially in cases where you are going to be using masking techniques. I've covered prepping the surface in a previous video, and I will at some point redo that video just because I think the quality of my videos has improved quite a bit since then. In this case, I really want to talk about masking. If you recall the video from last week where we were painting dice and we used a hand cut mask in order to paint that panel. And I specifically warned against cutting too deep. You do not want to cut into the surface that you're actually painting. Guess what I did? I didn't make it known in the previous video, but I actually cut that mask out twice, because the first time I attempted it, I cut far too deep, and you can see the delamination. Being very careful as I remove this to try and not stab the surface again. I cut into the paint. I can make excuses just like anybody else can, but at the end of the day, it comes down to me. This is my fault, 100%. I screwed up and cut too deep, but there is one other factor that could have contributed somewhat to the problem. This is the same panel that I used in the Starburst video. When I created that video, I did not prep this panel before I sprayed it black. I just sprayed it black and then started spraying the Starbursts over the top of it. Part of my reasoning was I wasn't going to be really using masking techniques other than the one that we used masking tape on. As you could see, I didn't get any delamination in that particular video, but I wasn't really sticking that tape down on the surface either. If you look at the very edges of this panel, you'll see where the paint started peeling up when I removed the entire mask on the panel as well. So a very small percentage of the failure could be attributed to the fact that no prep work was done on this panel. The greatest contributing factor is the fact that I just cut too deep. And I mean, I really cut too deep. I'm not sure if the camera is going to pick up the score marks all around this die, but I seriously did a terrible job cutting this out. I cut too deep everywhere. There's not a single section on this die that was done properly. The other contributing factor to my own failure is the fact that I am simply out of practice. There was a time when anytime we needed a paint mask cut, whether it was for a logo, lettering, graphics, whatever the case may be, it was a hand-cut paint mask. We haven't always had the ability to rely on a computer-generated paint mask. I've now had that ability for many, many years, and I choose to use that option far more often than I choose to hand-cut a paint mask for obvious reasons. It saves a ton of time. You no longer have to worry about cutting directly on the surface that you're painting. There's very little, if any, touch-up needed once you've removed all of the mask. It's a much cleaner mask that produces a much cleaner finished result. I also recognize that not everybody has access to a vinyl cutter, which is part of the reason I chose to use a hand-cut paint mask in the previous video. So we've seen my failure. We know what caused that failure. I cut too deep through the masking material and into the surface. So let's talk about some tricks and techniques that you guys can employ when you're hand cutting your own masks to hopefully prevent the same issue that you've seen in this video. The first is, regardless of what tool you choose to cut with, make sure you have a brand new blade and get used to changing that blade often. It takes far less pressure with a brand new blade to cut through your transfer tape, your masking tape, whatever you're using as a mask, compared to a dull blade. With a dull blade, it's going to require a little bit more pressure. You may not get all the way through on the first pass, which means you're going to have to make another pass, which heightens the risk of going through the material and into the surface that you're painting. Another tip is the angle you use with your blade. Let's talk about how you use your blade on a piece of transfer tape I have on the backboard of my easel. The one thing you do not want to do is to use the very tip of your blade to cut the material. Using the tip of the blade, you're far more likely to go through the transfer tape or whatever material you're using and into the substrate. The tip of the blade is also the sharpest, thinnest portion of the blade. It's very easy to break off the tip of your blade when you're cutting like that. A far better approach is to try and lay the blade as flat as possible. You can probably hear the difference between those two cuts. Using the very tip, there's a definite difference in the cutting sound compared to laying the blade flat and letting it glide along the surface. Same thing is true using a razor blade. I don't want to use the very corner of the blade to make my cuts because it's too easy to cut all the way through the material and into the surface that you're painting. It's also more difficult to cut clean, rounded edges when you're using the very tip or the corner of the blade. It's far easier to lay it down flat and let it glide along the surface. Those are really the only tips I have on this subject. It's not something that's super easy to do, but with practice you can get very proficient to the point that you won't be worried about cutting through and into the paint surface nearly as much. There was a time when I was very proficient at this as well. Now I'm just lazy. But I hope all of that makes sense. I hope you guys got something out of this. If you did, remember to like, subscribe, and share. I'm Trevor with Wicked Art Studio. I'll see you guys next time.